very Merry Christmas and tell you how much we love you, and we just celebrate the fact that God brought us all together. And
I really feel like that when we understand who we are, and we get our identity.
For 30 years, the world watched Joel Osteen beam from the largest stage in American faith, and the same woman stood beside him, calm and glowing and sure. Behind that polished image, though, a storm has trailed them for years. People whisper that the marriage is a performance, that something is breaking. Now Victoria has started to talk, and what she admits is more raw than the smile ever showed. The confession: Victoria never buried. For as long as this couple has been famous, a certain story has followed them around like a shadow that will not lift. The story says the marriage is not real. It says the warmth you see on stage is rehearsed, that the two of them quietly live separate lives, and that a divorce is always somewhere just around the corner. If you have ever watched a famous couple and quietly wondered whether any of it is true, you already understand why this story pulls at people the way it does. The strange thing is that the deepest crack this marriage ever carried was not put there by a scandal or a stranger. Victoria put it there herself, long before any of us were watching, and she has never once tried to hide it. Long before Victoria became the woman standing serenely beside America's most famous pastor, she was a young wife who liked things done her own way and did not handle it well when they were not. She has admitted this in her own words, and the honesty of it is startling when you consider how carefully everything else about the Osteen brand is presented. In the early years of the marriage, she was, by her own telling, difficult in the small daily ways that quietly wear a relationship down. She wanted control. She wanted to be right. And she reached a point where she felt God speak to her with a warning she has repeated many times since, that if she did not change the way she was behaving, she was going to change the very man she had fallen in love with. That line lands differently than most marriage advice because it puts the blame nowhere but on herself. She did not say Joel needed fixing. She said she was slowly reshaping a gentleman into someone harder and more guarded, and that the thought of doing that to him frightened her more than losing an argument ever could. So she made a decision that most of us find almost impossible in the heat of our own resentments. She chose to soften instead of demanding that he had to go first. If you have ever stayed angry at someone you love purely because backing down felt like losing, you already know how rare that kind of surrender actually is. What grew out of that decision became the private engine of their whole marriage. Victoria says the two of them almost never argue now, and the reason she gives is almost funny in its simplicity. You cannot fight with a man who refuses to fight back, and Joel, she says, simply will not engage. When they disagree, and she is quick to admit they disagree often, they let the matter sit, and they agree to disagree rather than turning it into a war. She wraps the whole philosophy in a phrase she returns to constantly, which is that they choose to walk in love even on the days they do not feel especially loving. There is something almost defiant in how ordinary that sounds. No secret, no trick, just two stubborn people who decided respect mattered more than winning. And to understand how a woman that's self-aware ended up preaching to 45,000 people every week, you have to travel back to a jewelry counter in Houston, to a time when neither she nor Joel had the slightest interest in standing in front of a church. Two people who never wanted a church. The beginning of their story has almost nothing to do with religion, which is the detail most people find hardest to believe. Victoria was not raised inside the world of televised faith. She grew up in Houston in a family that ran a fine jewelry business, and as a young woman, she worked behind that counter, selling watches and rings to strangers and expecting her life to stay comfortably ordinary. She had studied for a while, drifted like most young people do, and settled into the family trade without any grand plan for what came next. Nothing about those days hinted that her face would one day be beamed into 100 countries. Joel walked into that jewelry store somewhere around the middle of the 1980s, and the reason he came in is almost too plain for a story this size. He needed a battery for his watch. She helped him. Something passed between them that neither has ever fully explained, and by the spring of 1987, the two of them were married. The detail that upends what most people assume about them is almost absurdly simple. On the day they said their vows, neither Joel nor Victoria was a pastor, and neither planned to be. He was a quiet young man who preferred to stay out of sight, and she was a jeweler's daughter with no pulpit anywhere in her future. For 17 years, Joel worked in the shadows of his father's ministry, running the cameras and producing the television broadcasts for the church his dad had built. He was good at it, and he was content with it, and by every account, he had no desire whatsoever to stand where his father stood. His father, the booming and beloved preacher John Osteen, asked him again and again to step up and preach, and Joel turned him down every single time. There was a shyness in him that the stage terrified, and he was happy to let his father be the voice while he stayed behind the lens. Victoria, meanwhile, was building a life as a wife and a mother, comfortable in the role she had chosen and untroubled by any larger calling. If you had told either of them in those years that they would become two of the most recognized religious figures on the planet, they likely would have laughed in your face. Their ambitions were small and human and completely their own. None of the pull toward that pulpit came from hunger or design. It came instead from a single devastating stretch of days in the winter of 1999, when a loss arrived only a week after Joel finally found his voice. The week that rewrote their lives. For years, Joel had brushed off his father's requests to preach, and then, near the end of 1998, something in him shifted. John Osteen was seriously ill by then, worn down by kidney trouble and spending long hours on dialysis. And perhaps that fragility is what finally moved his son. In the middle of January of 1999, Joel agreed to do the thing he had avoided his entire life. He stepped up to preach his first real sermon, nervous and untested, having never gone to seminary and never once imagined himself as the man in front of the congregation. His father was too weak to be in the building that morning, and so he listened to his son's first sermon over the telephone from a hospital bed. It is a small and quietly heartbreaking image, an aging preacher tethered to a phone line, hearing the boy he had begged for years finally answer the call. Within a week of that sermon, John Osteen was gone, taken by a heart attack that left the enormous church he had founded suddenly without its voice. Joel has said that in the days after the shock, a strange and unfamiliar desire rose up in him to step forward and address the people his father had loved. It made no logical sense, and he knew it. He had preached exactly once. He had spent his whole adult life hiding behind a camera. And yet, he took the pulpit anyway, and the ministry did not shrink in his hands the way many people expected. It grew into something far larger than his father could have dreamed. But this story is not really about Joel finding the stage. It is about the woman who was suddenly pulled up there beside him without any warning at all. Victoria had married a television producer, not a preacher, and now she was expected to become a pastor's wife and eventually a co-pastor in her own right. She has spoken openly about how jarring that was, calling the whole thing a completely new game that she never saw coming when she said her vows. Nothing about it had been part of the plan she agreed to. She could have shrunk from it. Instead, she leaned into a line she still repeats whenever life turns without warning, reminding herself that nothing catches God off guard, even when it blindsides her. That quiet acceptance carried her onto a stage she never asked for. Fame, though, arrived carrying a rule book of its own, and some of the rules the Osteens chose to live by would leave the watching world genuinely puzzled. The rules that made people stare. Once the Osteens became famous, the public started noticing the peculiar way they guarded their marriage, and one rule in particular drew a great deal of attention. Joel has said openly that he never allows himself to be alone with a woman who is not Victoria. It is a practice often tied to the old evangelist Billy Graham, and more recently to the former Vice President Mike Pence. And Joel has confirmed that he has lived by it his whole career, exactly as his father did before him. He explains it by describing his mornings, saying he takes the first half hour of each day to search his own heart and ask whether he is still doing this for the right reasons. To his supporters, that sounds like a man protecting himself from the kind of scandal that has destroyed other preachers. To his critics, it sounds like something far more troubling. Legal scholars have pointed out that a powerful man who will only meet privately with other men can quietly wall women out of the very rooms where careers are made. One widely shared argument in Vox went so far as to call the practice likely illegal in an ordinary workplace because it hands men access and opportunity that women are simply denied. What looks like personal virtue from one angle starts to look like a locked door from another. And that tension has trailed Joel for years. Then there is the advice the two of them once gave that made a very different set of headlines. In an interview years ago, Joel encouraged wives to keep the spark alive by making an effort to look good. And he suggested, without much subtlety, that a trip to a certain lingerie store might not hurt. Victoria jumped in to soften it and clarify what he meant, joking that a woman should retire the same tired bathrobe she had worn for a decade and put a little care back into herself for her husband. It was meant warmly, as a nudge toward keeping romance alive, but it landed awkwardly for plenty of listeners who felt a pastor had no business commenting on their wardrobe or their marriage bed. Moments like that are exactly why the Osteens fascinate people. They present themselves as wholesome and simple, and then they say something that sends the entire internet into a spin. Odd household rules and cringeworthy advice were one thing, and the couple could laugh those off easily enough. Being marched off an airplane and hauled into a courtroom in front of the whole country was a test of a completely different weight. The courtroom and the clip. In December of 2005, Victoria boarded a flight from Houston bound for Colorado, sitting in first class beside Joel, and what happened next would follow her for years. A flight attendant named Sharon Brown later claimed that Victoria became enraged over a spill on her armrest and turned physically abusive, accusing her of shoving her against a bathroom door and elbowing her in the chest. The Osteens were escorted off the plane, the flight was delayed, and aviation authorities eventually fined Victoria $3,000 for interfering with a crew member. It was the kind of ugly and undignified episode that the couple's calm public image was never supposed to allow. The story did not end at the airport. 3 years later, in the summer of 2008, Brown took Victoria to court, seeking a public apology and a slice of her fortune as punishment, at one point demanding a share tied to Victoria's entire net worth. The trial became a spectacle, with a beloved pastor's wife forced to sit in a Houston courtroom and defend her character while the whole country watched. Both Victoria and Joel testified that no physical attack had ever taken place. After deliberating for only a couple of hours, the jury cleared Victoria completely. She walked out and said she was glad it was over, adding that she had expected to be vindicated because she knew the truth would stand. If the lawsuit tested her reputation, a short video clip years later tested her theology in front of millions. In the late summer of 2014, a brief moment from one of Victoria's messages spread across the internet like wildfire. In it, she told the congregation that when they worship and obey, they are not really doing it for God, but for themselves, because their happiness is what pleases God most. Stripped of context and looped endlessly, it struck many Christians as shallow and self-centered, and the backlash was brutal. One prominent commentator mocked her by comparing her words to a famously idiotic movie monologue, and the ridicule spread far beyond the usual religious circles. Joel, as he has always done, stepped in front of the criticism to shield his wife. He argued that the clip had been yanked out of a longer and gentler conversation, and that people had built an entire scandal out of a few careless seconds. Whatever you happen to make of her words, the instinct to protect her was immediate and total. Surviving all of that should have been the hard part. Instead, it opened the door to book deals, to some of the most famous people alive, and to one belief that would paint a permanent target on their backs. The empire, the icons, and the line they drew. Somewhere along the way, the shy producer and the jeweler's daughter turned into a publishing dynasty. Joel wrote one runaway bestseller after another, stacking up titles that topped the charts and sold in the millions until his name alone could move a book. Victoria proved she could do the very same. Her book about loving your life arrived in 2008 and shot near the top of the bestseller lists within a matter of weeks, and she went on to write for children as well, even launching a program to put books into the hands of kids who had none. Between the two of them, they were no longer just preachers. They had become a brand that reached millions of homes every single week across more than 100 nations. That kind of reach pulls powerful people into your orbit, and the Osteen circle grew star-studded. When Kanye West took his very public turn toward faith, it was Joel who welcomed him, and in the autumn of 2019, the rapper appeared at Lakewood before a packed and roaring crowd. The two men spoke often after that, and a friendship formed that surprised almost everyone who heard about it. When the couple pulled together a virtual Easter service during the lockdown of 2020, the names attached read like the lineup of an awards show, with Mariah Carey and Tyler Perry lending their voices to the broadcast. The jeweler's daughter from Houston was now trading messages with some of the most famous people on the planet. And yet, for all that reach and all those famous friends, the Osteens drew one line that has cost them dearly in the eyes of many. Years ago, sitting with Larry King, both Joel and Victoria made clear they believed marriage belonged only between a man and a woman. And Joel has repeated versions of that belief many times since, framing it gently as his idea of God's best, while insisting he is not attacking anyone. To his followers, it is faithfulness to Scripture. To his critics, it is a wound, and no amount of soft phrasing has ever fully healed it. Same-sex marriage became the law of the land not long after, and the tension between their message of universal welcome and that particular boundary has never quite gone away. That contradiction sits right at the heart of who the Osteens are. They preach acceptance and joy to a global audience, and they hold a private conviction that leaves part of that audience standing outside the door. Through every scandal, every lawsuit, every viral clip, and every accusation thrown at them, Victoria has kept choosing the same man and the same message. When she says she respects him and honors him, she is not reading from a script. She is describing the one thing that has quietly survived everything the spotlight has ever thrown at it. So after everything these two have survived together, I really want to know what you truly believe. Whether this is a real marriage that fought to stay standing, or a partnership that simply learned to perform on cue. Tell me exactly where you land in the comments below, because your honest take on this one matters to me.